Good evening, viewers, and very welcome to another Capture webcast. It has been a while since last time. We have been on a bit of a summer break. So I'm quite excited to be back. I hope you are all hungry for some Capture content. And somewhat unexpectedly, almost at least, I have a bit of news to share with you. I'm taking that as a sign of a slow return to what might resemble normal times, even though, yeah, we have some patience. So the first bit of news would be that Obsidian Controls have released a new version of their Onyx software. That would be version 4.6. Among other exciting news for the Onyx programmers, it also features libraries from Atlabase, who are our library providers as well. So if you're a Capture user who also happens to be using Onyx, this is good news for you, as potentially this may improve your patch exchange experience. I didn't manage to clear out whether Onyx had patch exchange with Capture before this release or not. The truth of the matter is that this version has been available in beta for some time, so yeah. But either way, with version 4.6 there is patch exchange with Capture, and that should work really well. So if you're an Onyx user, do make sure to check that out if you haven't already. Next piece of news is from Russia, where we have 2 trade shows, and the first one is actually already running. It's the ProLight and Sound show. is actually not running yet, but will soon be running. I'm sorry for my slightly confused state here. So the Pro Light and Sound show starts the 16th of September, so that's not many days away now. Takes place in Moscow in Russia, where you will be able to learn more about capture at the ImLight stand at NAM, Russia. And the second show I wanted to report to you about is actually, that is the one that is already running. So this show opened the 13th, which would be yesterday. And that's the Interlight Russia show, which is combined with the Intelligent Building Russia show. And our Russian resellers ImLight are there with the booth as well, which you can see on the picture on that side. As you can see, they have our nice logo on the booth as well. And they are also showing Madrix, which we congratulate on their, I hope I get this right now, the 25th anniversary. So there might be some party on the stand, I don't know. So, some shows going on, which is great news, and hopefully we will have some more news coming back to the webcast again. It's been awfully silent the past year, as we've been in various lockdowns. So, tonight I have prepared for you a special on file formats, and I do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webcast. Write them in the chat below, I believe it's below me, and my colleague will help relay them to me so I can answer them. Keep in mind it may take a minute or so before the question reaches me, so don't sit and hold back on your questions, fire them away, and I will try to grab them and answer them as we go throughout the presentation. So let's switch over to Keynote mode, where I have a disturbingly long presentation for you, but I hope I managed to make this interesting. So we're talking about file formats, which is something that can probably be quite confusing. To be honest, it can confuse me too, quite often. I did have to do a fair bit of research for this presentation. There are simply too many formats out there that we support. So I looked up on Wikipedia what their definition of a file format is. It's a bit vague, but it goes like this. A file format is a standard way that information is encoded for storage in a computer file. It specifies how bits are used to encode information in a digital storage medium. That might not mean a lot to you, but a few keywords here are: file format is a standard, which means it's something that stays kind of the same over some period of time. It encodes information in a computer file. And as I'm sure you all know, there are plenty of file formats, so it's safe to say that the same piece of information could be stored in many different ways. If you think about a file format for a book, for instance, it could be a PDF document, it could be a Word document, you might even decide to write it in Excel if you are that type of person. So which format you want to use will depend on a number of things. Now, some of the key aspects to a file format are: what kind of information is inside it? Is it structured in a way that it favors fast reading and writing? Or perhaps it's structured in a way that favors a small file size. So if you think, for instance, about video files and video editing, you will want to work with some file formats when you are editing, but once you are done with the product and you want to send it somewhere or put it online, you might want to use another format. Even though it's essentially about the same thing, video, you still choose to use different formats for different purposes. So I've come up with this fictive little story about two companies called Triangle CAD and Pentagon CAD. Trying to add some colors here to keep you awake. So we have Triangle CAD that stores TDG files and Pentagon CAD that stores PDG files. Extensions have to be hard to pronounce and confusing. This is important. In Triangle CAD, the world is made of triangles, and in Pentagon CAD, the world is made of pentagons. So, actually, that was a bit fast. So, if you are a Triangle CAD user, you will not be able to transfer your work into Pentagon CADs because a triangle is not the same thing as a pentagon. You cannot mix between the softwares. The file formats are incompatible. However, if you look at the pentagons, you may realize that a pentagon can actually be made up of triangles. So in Pentagon CAD, there might be an export to Triangle CAD. Now, it might create some ugly lines in the pentagons, but it's probably still useful for you. Unfortunately, though, you couldn't go the other way because you can't create a triangle out of pentagons. And if you're ever bored, that's an interesting exercise, trying to draw pentagons until you don't get triangles. Anyway. Now imagine that these two companies, they go out on trade shows, they meet people, and for some reason the world has discovered circles. And now everyone wants to build buildings out of circles. So both softwares have to support circles. Now at this point, people will also start complaining that, it's a bit of a mess going between softwares. It would be great if there was just one file format. So these companies managed to collaborate and create a new format that is shared between them. Now, Triangle CAD still doesn't understand pentagons, and Pentagon CAD does not understand triangles, but at least there are some common things you can edit. This is all well. Some time passes, and the good folks at Triangle CAD, they are desperately trying to find some new technology, something new to sell to their users to make money from. So they spend millions of dollars or euros or whatever in a research project to find the next great thing, which is stars. So what are they going to do now? Are they going to call Pentagon CAD, despite having spent millions on discovering the star, and tell them, hey guys, let's add stars to our shared file format? No, probably not. They want to keep the competitive advantage, but that means they can no longer use the shared file format. So this silly example is trying to illustrate why there are so many file formats, because every time a piece of software thinks of something new, by definition, they can only put it in their own format. And the shared formats will always be lagging behind. And this is perhaps one of the main reasons there are so many file formats. It's simply because someone thought of something new, like the blue star here, and they didn't want to share it with anyone until they had collected some good money from the software market. Not that we would ever do anything like that, but anyway. So I can see we've already got a couple of questions. So if you do have questions, please keep them coming. I have, yes, a couple of relatively detailed questions. I'm going to save them a few minutes, so I have talked a bit more about specifics. This is something of an overview of the file formats we support in Capture for import and export. I'm going to cover the two main categories, and that's 3D models and patch. I'm not going to talk about image formats, at least not unless you ask me questions about it. So the 3D models or 3D model formats we support are 3ds for 3D Studio, and this is a really old format that was deprecated in 1998. We have C4D. These are in alphabetic order. C4D is Cinema 4D's file format. We have DWG, which is an acronym for drawing. This is the AutoCAD file format. I have omitted DXF, which is a predecessor to DWG. but it stores the same information, but it is encoded in a different way. GLTF is the second to most recent. This is a shared file format created by the same people behind OpenGL. OpenGL, GLTF. MVR is the newest. This is from Vectorworks and MA Lighting. Then we have OBJ, which is a really old format. It's around the same age as 3ds. This comes from Wavefront. I always get this wrong. Wavefront was a company that made a software called Advanced Visualizer, I believe. And finally, SKP for the SketchUp file format. Now, in this type of files, there is some specific type of information that we may expect. And there are the things I've listed here. There is both the 3D stuff itself, but also some general metadata or information about the 3D stuff. Metadata is information about information. So we have identification. This is ID numbers for things in the file. We have type information for keeping trusses apart from scenic elements, and fixture data for things like patch and such. And then, of course, all the actual 3D stuff. So the actual 3D stuff, the most basic part are the coordinates. And as I'm sure you know, 3D stuff is made up of triangles, and each triangle has 3 corners. So for this example of a rhombus, we have 4 points or corners or vertices. These form 2 faces or triangles. This is the basis of most 3D stuff. Now we can start building on this. One commonly existing feature is edge visibility. So if you have a wireframe view of a stage, you probably don't want a lot of lines and clutter in the middle of the stage floor, so you want to hide some edges. This, of course, needs to be stored in the file. Moving on, normals is a way of describing, for instance, the smoothness of a surface. It can be used both as part of the 3D data, but it can also be stored in textures. So when you put normals in textures, you can create surface variations on a single triangle. Instead of using lots of triangles, you can also use normals, as in this example, to create a smoothing effect without using textures. And also worth mentioning are texture coordinates or UV maps, which is mapping textures or images onto the surfaces. So let's take a look at these 3D file formats that Capture support and see how they fare in these different features. Identification. Imagine you import the same piece of scenery into Capture twice. Maybe one day it's the base design, then there have been some changes made and you want to re-import to update parts of the design. When you do that, you don't want to get duplicates, so you need IDs on objects to see which objects are still the same and which are new. You will not find something like that in 3ds or OBJ. In DWG, it's not exactly part of the format, but the way everyone uses it, it's kind of an implicit standard, so I give them half a check mark in this case. Now, type information, which may be knowing that this 3D thing is a piece of truss and this 3D thing is a fixture, is harder to come by. Again, in DWG, you can put the information in there. There is no real standard for it. In MVR, now remember MVR comes from Vectorworks and MA Lighting. So MVR has type information for the sum of the types of objects that Vectorworks has. So you might, for instance, find that an object is a focus point, which is a concept we don't have in Capture, but you will not find that an object is an LED panel, for instance, because they work with projection surfaces, or at least the format does. Now GLTF has some type information, but actually it's not very detailed there either. Now this is an export format from Capture, and until other softwares actually consume it more actively, there isn't much meaning in having this information in there, if we're being honest. Fixture data. Now in DWG you can add attributes to any block, and so you can have an attribute called patch, an attribute called weight, and so on, and these can store fixture data. When you export DWGs from Capture, you will find attributes on all the blocks with information like this. Capture, however, does not support importing this information from a DWG. MVR has some fixture data, but it is very limited. Basically, if you take all the fixture properties in Vectorworks and all the fixture properties in MA3, and you identify the few ones that exist in both systems, then those are the ones you will find in MVR. Now GLTF, in this case, as exported by Capture, has all of the fields you would find in Capture, with a few exceptions, I believe, but generally speaking, it is all there. So let's talk about the actual geometry. Do keep questions coming. I am very soon going to start answering them here. So coordinates, 3D edges, of course, exist in all file formats. There is an interesting limitation in the 3ds format in the number of coordinates it supports. So each object can only have up to around 65,000 coordinates. This usually is not an issue. And the reason MVR suffers from the same limitation is that MVR is based on 3ds. Edge visibility available in all file formats. Normal information for smoothing of surfaces is terribly flawed in 3ds. It basically does not exist. 3ds has a concept of smoothing groups, which is vague at best. So as a result, MVR suffers from the same problem. Now in DWG files, there is next to no normal information stored whatsoever. However, DWG may understand that something is a cylinder, and as a result of that, you could generate normals for a cylinder. So they get half a check mark here. And texture coordinates for material and texture mapping are available in pretty much all the file formats. But again, in DWG, you work more with projections, which is actually the same thing as manual mapping in Capture. So it can only store a limited kind of texture coordinates. So I received a couple of questions here already. One is from Archive TT24. He or she is asking, is there a format that allows exporting lighting plot information over from Vectorworks? The MVR column that I have here is that format. However, keep in mind that, if you look at the fixture data row there, you can see it has a check mark in parentheses, and that is because there are several fields from Vectorworks that are not included in MVR. You will get one patch point, a circuit number, a unit number, and a channel number, but that's pretty much it. You don't get, you get some, but not all focus information. No filters, gobo, shutter cuts, or more detailed aspects of the lighting design. Alfonso Torrealba has written two questions actually. He says, when I export from Capture to WYSIWYG, not all textures are saved, and if I do it from WYSIWYG to Capture, yes. So if you import MVR in Capture, then we support reading materials with textures. However, the MVR export does not include materials and textures. There's a number of reasons for that, the primary one being that the material model of the 3ds file format is so old and outdated that it is hardly meaningful to try and export PBR materials into a 3ds file. It is not going to look correct anyway. So we decided not to do that at that point. Now this is a very detailed chart and possibly even too detailed for many of you. So I've made a simplification. If you want to take models, 3D objects, in or out of Capture, I would recommend using the ones with a gold star. The OBJ file format is okay. It's relatively easy for softwares to implement, and it supports a good amount of data. The SketchUp file format is robust. It supports materials and textures and is a great way of going from SketchUp into Capture. And the same thing for the C4D format for Cinema 4D users. It is great for going into Capture with your 3D objects. If you are not a SketchUp or Cinema 4D user, then I recommend using GLTF. Especially if you are a Blender user, for instance, then GLTF is the #1 format for you to use. The other file formats I would generally not recommend for 3D objects unless they are your only choice. If you do like working with materials and applying them to your objects, then I would recommend staying away maybe from the OBJ file format, which has a number of limitations like texture names, the awkwardness of storing texture images next to the file. The list goes on. SketchUp, on the other hand, actually embeds the textures inside the SketchUp file. And Cinema 4D has a pretty decent material model. We don't exactly read PBR properties out of it, but it is quite robust and works well. Materials can also be carried in MVR into Capture. That is, at least if you go from a software that does not use PBR materials, then you can get them into Capture as a starting point and then enhance them. And of course GLTF, which supports all the PBR materials that Capture supports. Now, if you do work with PBR materials, if this is your thing, then GLTF is the only option I would recommend here. I would stay away from all the other formats. They will not make you a happy person. And finally, if as part of this you also want to get fixtures and patch information, then MVR and GLTF are your only options. When you go into Capture, you can only use MVR, and when you go out of Capture, I would definitely recommend using GLTF, because then you get all the patch you need, given of course that the software you are going to actually supports it, which at the moment is not very likely, but I believe there will be some news about that in the beginning of next year actually. So one question we have from Alfonso Torrealba is about textures with MVR. The fact that if you go from Capture to MA3 using MVR, you do not get any textures. So I guess the question is whether I can confirm this, and yes, this is the case. If you export MVR from Capture, you do not get any textures. For one, the material model in MVR is that of 3ds, which is very primitive, and also MVR is maybe a great format for taking your lighting designs into a console more than into a lighting design software. And console visualizers usually have much more restricted resource abilities. And if you were to take a high-resolution, detailed PBR texture into a system like that, it's not very likely that it would work well anyway. So that is part of the reason it simply is not included. Martin Goth also asks, can I import SolidWorks or step files into Capture? We do not support the SDP or step file format at the moment. We don't have any plans for it at the moment either. However, there is a vague plan to look into maybe recommending a conversion software or something like that. We did review the step file format, and it doesn't really add a lot, apart possibly from getting compatible with other softwares. But we would rather see that other softwares add GLTF support, because GLTF is a new format that is more aligned with the needs of this type of software. Now, I also want to say a few things about patch file types. And the ones worth mentioning here are CSV or XML, MVR, and GLTF as it is exported from Capture with our own extension. Now, CSV and XML files are incredibly flexible file formats that could be used to store almost any data. So it's easy to say they support anything, but in reality, I've tried to incorporate what other softwares out there actually support. So this is more about what you can do with these formats here and now, rather than what you could do with them in theory. Now, when exporting patch, we need to know what type of fixtures we're dealing with. What is the name of the fixture? Is it maybe an ETC source 4? Even better is to have IDs for the fixture type. It could be an RDM ID, an Atlabase ID, or a Corallon ID. Obviously, we want to know how the fixture is patched. This is perhaps the main point here. And many fixtures today, or some at least, have multiple patch points. And of course, you also need to know which DMX mode or modes these patch points use. Now, in addition to this, it may be useful to have things like channel numbers, layer associations, filters, and gobos, as well as knowing, for instance, that this scroller here is attached to this fixture here. So let's quickly do the breakdown for these formats, looking at these key aspects. Now, the fixture names obviously can go in any of these formats. In terms of fixture identification, when you export GLTF from Capture, we refer to Atlabase identifiers. When you work with MVR, then you could have RDM identifiers of the fixtures, but this requires you to have GDTF files for the fixtures. And the same type of limitation applies to DMX modes and patch points, which you can have in MVR, but again, you need to have a GDTF file in order to identify a DMX mode. Other information like unit numbers, circuit numbers, and so on are supported to some extent by all formats, but again, MVR only supports a select few of the ones in Vectorworks that happen to overlap with what you also have in MA3D. In terms of design organization, the layer model in MVR is hierarchical, which means that there is a layer on root level, and then all objects beneath that have the same layer. Now, in Capture, we have another layer concept where you can group objects, and any object in that group can be in a different layer. As a result of this, you could store a Capture layer approach in an MVR file, but you cannot necessarily take an MVR layer system into Capture. And I presume the reason they've gone for this is that is the way layers work in Vectorworks. In terms of accessories like filters and gobos and barn doors, this is not supported by MVR. There is a field in MVR for a filter color, like an RGB value, although it's a CIE value, but anyway. So there's no way of saying this is a Roscoe 7 or a Lee something else. There's just a color. So for transmitting lighting design, that's not very helpful at all. Whereas, of course, if you export GLTF from Capture, you do get that information neatly organized. And in terms of combining fixtures together, this is a part of our GLTF export as well. It's not supported by MVR. Now, when you're talking about CSV files, if you look, for instance, at EOS, Light-Write Import-Export, what they do is they put fixtures that are assembled together, they will have the same channel number. So if there are 3 rows with the same channel number, that could be the yoke, the fixture, and the scroller, for instance. So that kind of, standard is the wrong word, but that kind of approach can be used with CSV to signal fixtures that have been combined, but it's up to every software to have such specific behavior. And this is why we have an EOS patch export in Capture that is specific, that uses their system, so that you can export patch from Capture into EOS and get these things right. So if you have, I'm nearing the end here, both of the presentation and possibly your patience. So if you have any more questions, then please shoot them at this point, because yeah, we are near the end. I just want to point out again, in case you missed that the way I've talked about these file formats is from a perspective of what you can do with them with Capture. It's possible that you could do more or less things with these file formats with other softwares. So you have to take our recommendations and combine them with the softwares you are working with to see what makes sense and how. I'm going to bring back this image here, which is basically our recommendation of usage of these file formats. Dave Cool says, can you also compare with other consoles? This MVR approach should be open, but MA and Vectorworks still seem to be dominating the game. What about CamSys, which also supports MVR? So yes, CamSys or Magic Viz supports reading MVR files. So you can export your design from Capture using the MVR file format and take that into CamSys, Magic Viz. However, because of the limited handling of patch in MVR, it might be better actually if you just export the model from Capture using MVR, and then you use CITP patch exchange to get the fixtures across. Because then probably the modes will work a lot better. At this point, to the best of my knowledge, the only consoles that support MVR import here and now are Magic Viz and MA3D. Now, I'm aware of some other things happening, but I'm worried of disclosing something that's not official. Of course, there is more MVR support coming, and as part of the online collaborative process between Vectorworks, MA Lighting, us, and other console manufacturers, it has been brought forward that there is a lot missing from the MVR format. But really it is up to the people at Vectorworks and MA to decide whether, if, or how to expand the MVR file format to accommodate other design softwares and other consoles. Here and now, it is very hard to look at the spec without saying that it is tailored specifically for Vectorworks and MA3D. Matthias from Kernfusion is asking, how is the CITP protocol compared to these patch formats. So the idea of the CITP protocol is to have a live communication between capture and the console. The difference between that and the file format, of course, is that a file is something you could send to someone and you don't need to have the console connected to capture at the time. So they really have different use cases in a way. Now the CITP protocol actually includes most of the data that you would find in a GLTF export from capture. So you will find unit numbers, circuit numbers, 3D coordinates, orientation, ATLA-based identifiers for DMX modes, patch points. So in general, I would say it is very close to a GLTF export from capture. So it has more features than if you were to use MVR, for instance. But it's probably comparable to using some kind of CSV-based patch exchange. So you can export patch in CSV from capture, and you could import that in Magic Viz, for example. That would also work well. And I do realize that the unfortunate result of capture supporting all of these formats and being so flexible is that in a way it makes it hard for you to know which one to use. So that's one of the reasons we're having this webcast. And if you have more questions tonight or in the future about formats, then please do drop them at this or the next webcast. Dave Cool says, it seems CITP works better than MVR. Well, if capture is connected to the console to begin with, and both speak CITP, then it is definitely better at transferring the patch than MVR, but CITP will not transfer any scenic design elements. It will not transfer any 3D objects. So that is, CITP only focuses on the fixtures. So it's a bit like comparing apples and carrots, or whichever vegetable you prefer. But if you are not connected with the console, then CITP doesn't work at all. So there is that to consider as well. Now, CITP actually hasn't moved. There haven't been any changes in CITP in quite a while. And at this point, I'm not sure the industry is that interested in that kind of communication. It seems to me that it is more interesting today to transfer files that contain your design rather than having this live connection between capture and the console. Having said that, though, it is incredibly powerful when it works. So if you check out the capture communication with Avolite's Titan software, for instance, it is pretty impressive what happens when you patch, change patch, and move fixtures around, seeing the console synchronize and respond to this in real time. And Dave also mentions that yeah, he works on a console that has an internal viz, so he doesn't need capture for that. Yes, so, and that is becoming quite popular. Many consoles today have some kind of built-in viz. So I think we have reached the end here. I've answered quite a few questions. I'm happy with that. So thank you for shooting these questions to me. Thank you for watching, and we will be back soon again in a few weeks to look at some exciting news from us, or I think everything we do is exciting, so anyway. And then we have one more webcast towards the end of the year, which is going to be our traditional Christmas special, where we give you some sneak peeks on what's coming in the future, and maybe some gifts, and maybe even a competition of some sorts. We'll see. It hasn't been planned in detail yet. Thanks everyone for watching, and see you soon again.
Bye.